Okay, thank you, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the NASA CMS Policy Speaker Series for October 2021. I'm going to start with the welcome as we are getting people joining in into this talk. I'm going to give a brief welcome, give some announcements from the side of the carbon monitoring system, and then formally introduce today's speakers, Jason Bordoff and Melissa Lott. So first of all, I would like to excuse and send along the regards and the appreciation from George Hurd, who is the CMS Science Team Lead. And today we're honored to have Jason Bordoff, who is the co-founding dean of the New Columbia Climate School and the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and his colleague Melissa Lott, who is a senior research scholar and the director of research at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And today's talk is on the energy transition in perspective. So before moving to the talk, I would just like to remind you all to visit our website, carbon.nasa.gov, and there you will have all of the information on the CMS initiative, recently funded CMS projects, data products archive and available to be used by stakeholders, and our upcoming events and stakeholder engagement efforts. We have 70 new CMS projects that are announced, and the information on the projects is now available on the CMS website. As always, if you have any recommendations on speakers or topics you would like to see in future Policy Speaker Series seminars, or any suggestions about activities or events, please reach out to me. I just want to remind you all that we're having our annual CMS applications workshop for stakeholders next month on November 16, 2021. It's going to be via WebEx remote. So you can find more information about the workshop on our website. We're going to have different panels on some of the CMS themes. We're going to have panels on COP26, on capacity building, time for discussion. So if you're interested, go to our website. You can find more information. And if you have any questions about registration for the meeting, just send me an email. And a final reminder that we have an ongoing call for papers for a special issue of the journal Environmental Research Letters. And this is with a focus on carbon monitoring research and applications. So this call is going to be staying open until the end of the year. If you're planning to draft a paper related to carbon monitoring, and that include user application stakeholder needs, please consider this a special issue. So now I would like to formally introduce today's speakers, Jason Bordoff and Melissa Lott. Mr. Bordoff joined the Columbia University faculty after serving until January 2013 as a special assistant to President Barack Obama and senior director for energy and climate change on the staff of the National Security Council. And prior to that, holding senior policy positions on the White House National Economic Council and Council on Environmental Quality. Dr. Lott has worked as an engineer and researcher for more than 15 years in the USA, Europe, and Asia. She specializes in technology and policy research, working to increase our understanding of the impacts of our energy system on air pollution and public health. They will discuss today the policies needed to avert the worst impacts of climate change and how carbon emissions data can assist policymakers in this effort. And this is something very relevant for the CMS scientific community. I just want to announce that we will have at least the last 15 minutes for a Q&A and a discussion at the end of their presentations. So feel free to post your questions and comments on the chat box that you see there. Now, without further ado, I leave you all with Jason and with Melissa. Jason.
Thanks so much for welcoming us here today. I appreciate it. And apologies, Jason is on his way to join us and will be here momentarily. So
I'm here, Melissa.
Here. Hey, Jason.
Yeah. But thanks for having us. And yeah, I'll turn it to you, Melissa, to kick it off if you want.
I'm sure. So I'll just say the topic that we're discussing today and what Adil just said about how important data and evidence is really something near and dear to our hearts here at CEGEP. So if you look at the history of the center, and Jason will talk about in a minute about how we came to be and how we came to be at Columbia and our evolving work with the new climate school at Columbia, it's all about taking theories and putting numbers and evidence next to them and helping folks to make more informed decisions when it comes to decision making processes, including policy. So, when a decision maker is trying to make a big decision that will have repercussions for all of our lives and will impact our economies, how do they do it with some independent, unbiased information in front of them? So, Jason, if you want to step us through kind of the history, because this was your idea starting off the center, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. I can't, you can't see slides now, can you?
We can see the first slide, and I think
Oh, you
you're
can.
driving.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're good. Now we see the
Got it.
second.
Okay.
Perfect.
So I think do
So
you want
we'll
to say a
go
little
through.
bit? Why don't you kick it off and say a little bit about the Center on Global Energy Policy and how we approach things, and then I'll take it from there. Is that okay?
That sounds great. So today we're going to step through a couple different things. For those of y'all in the room who aren't familiar with the Center on Global Energy Policy and the new climate Columbia, we're going to talk through that. And then we're going to talk about the current status of the energy transition, policies to address climate change, and really this role of data and evidence, the things that y'all help us with in these processes and in making the most informed choices that we can. So in terms of the Center on Global Energy Policy, we became a center about just over 8 years ago. Jason was working in the White House, as Adil just mentioned, and he was faced with making a bunch of different decisions, like many of us are, where there's not a lot of time. You've got to sort through a lot of information, and you're looking for a trusted, independent, evidence-based organization to provide information to help inform the decisions that you're making. So at CEGEP, what we try to do is take these smart, actionable, and evidence-based energy and climate solutions that we develop through research, that we develop through bringing the evidence base together, and communicate it on timelines and in formats that really enable informed decision making. We're not advocating for any particular output with it. We are trying to inform the process so that people who are making these really big decisions can have the information they need to do it in an informed way. And so there's really three pillars to this. We work around the education pillar, providing career and mentorship opportunities. We're at a university. We work with a lot of students, and we teach courses across the School of International and Public Affairs, where we are housed at Columbia. We also have this background I just talked about around analysis. So looking at data-driven policy solutions. So I can say as a personal anecdote, I work in this public health space. There's a lot of discussions around how decarbonization will be great for public health. That is true in many cases, but when you run the numbers, you realize that each of our choices have trade-offs. Some of them will maximize benefits and some don't appear to be. So running those numbers is extremely important. So this type of analysis, best-in-class research that's accessible to groups outside of the university in which we work. And then also convening. We very often, through public and private events, bring key experts and decision makers into a room together to have conversations, to facilitate these dialogues that need to happen when you're trying to solve these really complex problems. Do you mind going to the next slide, please? And so we have a bunch of different initiatives. I'll just highlight a couple of them. One is our energy journalism initiative. So in terms of informing, enabling, and educating, we work with journalists around the country and actually around the world. We brought in a number of international journalists in this last year to say, okay, you're new to the energy and environment beat. Let's go through a one-on-one. Let's talk through what the differences are between zero carbon and renewables and how the problems that you're looking into and the events you're looking into, what are the fundamental knowledge base that you may or may not have gotten in your career so far or in your formal education. Let us help kind of be a source of answers and a source of this independent analysis and evidence. We have a number of different research initiatives. So one highlighted here is our carbon management research initiative, which is about focusing on how we accelerate decarbonization through carbon management technologies. So this can be things like direct air capture, it can be carbon capture, utilization, and storage, what we call carbon to products or carbon to fuel, which basically means taking these greenhouse gases that are causing us a lot of challenges right now and actually turning them into useful things. So storing that carbon in a way that is also useful. So whether it's in cement or embedding it in other products. We also track policy commitments around the world and around in different countries to say what are countries doing and what can we learn from those actions in terms of mitigating climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions across lots of different sectors, and what can we learn from maybe something that's happening in the EU that we could apply in the US or in Indonesia or somewhere else that we're working. We can go to the next slide. Jason, if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. And one of the exciting things that actually brought me to Columbia and keeps my days, and I know Jason's days as the dean of the school, one of the co-founding deans, very exciting, is actually a new climate school that was established in the last year. And it's designed to actually train the next generation of leaders and support high impact work across the university around climate and around climate change. Because what we see is that the challenge of climate change is not something that's going to be solved even if we reach net zero by mid-century. There will be ongoing challenges, and really having a school like maybe universities in the past to develop public health schools. Now we are developing the nation's first climate school. So it's meant to be a hub of interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary work, bringing in all the people who need to be in the middle of creating a solution space. So in that, you need engineers who understand the technical sides of the solution. You need finance and business people who understand what the barriers are to getting it into the world and getting money behind it. And you need policy specialists, people who understand how you design policies and regulations to support actually having climate solutions enter the world that we are living in. The next slide, please.
Do you want me to talk about some of these?
Yeah,
or
I think you should absolutely talk about the impact lab, et cetera.
Well, I think the idea in trying to think about a climate school is how do we not only do the extraordinary research that only a university like Columbia can, scientists like those at Lamont Doherty can, work many people on this call do, but how do we think about the institutional capabilities for impact and external engagement and partnerships to make sure that the knowledge we're creating at a university is informing and being used by the work that people are doing in the policy world? What's the next big piece of legislation now that some of this legislative package may not succeed? What are the new and innovative ideas that might emerge as policy approaches, but they're rooted in not just what is popular or politically feasible by what research says will actually make the biggest dent in the problem. And the same is true for the kind of solutions we need in finance. We sit in the middle of New York City, the home of the world's financial sector, and we know, according to the IEA, that we need somewhere around $100 trillion of additional capital investment in clean energy, which is more CapEx intensive than OpEx, between now and 2050 to get to our climate goals. So across a range of issues, you need the fundamental science, you need the new technologies, like how do we build cheaper electrolyzers to get hydrogen to be more cost effective? But then how do you think about the range of barriers, finance, policy, new business models, justice, social acceptance, foreign policy issues? I worked with the National Security Council, so that those solutions can get to scale at the scale we need out in the world. So we're trying to build a range of those into the climate school as well. I think here I was going to, unless Melissa, there was other stuff you wanted to say, sort of talk a little bit just about where we are in the energy transition, which helps motivate sort of some of our thinking about how we're doing our work at the Center on Global Energy Policy and the Climate School. So I'll just maybe jump into that. I guess, and this is all quite relevant because many of us will be in Glasgow next week for the UN climate talks and thinking about what success looks like there, which expectations are being downplayed a little bit because not enough countries are stepping up with their own commitments. We've yet to see what, say, China will put on the table as its own nationally determined contribution. There's going to be still a lot of pledges and commitments. There's understandable skepticism about whether all of those should be taken as binding and will actually be achieved. The US has a commitment to be 50 to 52% lower emissions by 2030 relative to 2005. And we obviously have our own political challenges putting the infrastructure in place, the policy infrastructure in place to do that. But the Biden administration is working with Congress toward a package that looks like it'll have very significant incentives for clean energy, regulations through the Clean Air Act, say with the Environmental Protection Agency, with cars and power plants, and then state level action, like what California, New York, and others are doing, which is quite impactful. And when you put all those things together, it can get you a good part of the way there, but there's still a lot more to do at the same time that many other countries are making commitments. Many companies are making commitments. It's not necessarily clear everyone realizes exactly what it takes to achieve those goals. So ambition is good, but the broad frame for how we're thinking about where we are now is a gap between ambition and reality that is getting larger, not smaller, each and every day. And that has to change if we're going to get where we need to go. And it's really hard because energy transitions take a really long time. We don't have that much time left. If you look at energy transitions over time, it took 50 years for coal to get to 40% of the energy mix. It took 50 years for oil to get to 30%, 50 years for gas to get to 20%. This data is a couple of years old, but we're not much higher if you think of non-hydro renewables beyond 5% now. It's a bit higher, but it takes a long time for the global energy system to turn over. And I think that that is why things take a long time. And also, we need to remember we're doing that in the context of rising global energy demand. So on the left here, you see when people talk of an energy transition, they typically think of something like what's on the left. We have seen these great transitions throughout history, from going back to 1850, from wood to coal and coal to oil and oil to gas, and increasingly, although still small, zero carbon energy. What you see on the right is the same exact data, just not as a percent of the total, but total energy use, total BTUs. And we've almost never used less of anything. We're using more of everything today than we did in the past, because the world's getting wealthier, and there's a strong connection between GDP growth and population growth and energy use, and that is going to continue moving forward. I think about there was an announcement today about the leadership council to the United Nations Sustainable Energy for All program, which I was honored to be part of. It's a really important thing for me. It's an important issue for the Center on Global Energy Policy. Not only are there 800 million people around the world who have no access to electricity at all, but when you think of the math, like energy math, and you model what it takes to give those people, quote, energy access, that's often modeled as the amount of electricity that might turn on some light bulbs or charge cell phones. If you think about the amount of energy it takes for prosperity, just a small fraction of what we take for granted, cars, refrigerators, air conditioners, the numbers get really big, really, really fast. And many parts of the world, billions of people are using almost no energy today. They also did not cause the problem we have today. What matters for climate, obviously, is cumulative CO2 emissions. About a quarter of those come from the US, almost as much from the European Union, 2% from the entire continent of Africa. So that is the challenge. And that is entirely inconsistent where we're headed right now with anything close to what we need to see happen in order to bring emissions to consistent with what 1.5 degrees warming would look like. And you can decide for yourself if you think a decline in emissions that looks something like this is likely to happen, given what the world looks like today. Oil use is going up, coal use is going up, gas use is going up. Obviously, part of that is recovery from a pandemic. There were ideas that we could have a green recovery from a pandemic. They were always a little overblown, I think, in our view, because there were investments you could make in green recovery that might pay dividends a decade or more from now. But fundamentally, the energy infrastructure we have is what it is. The factories that are built, the power plants that are built, the cars that are on the road, you shut the global economy down. And we should remember, even that is a sobering reminder of how hard this problem is, right? We at one point, more than 4 billion people around the world were on economic lockdown as a necessary public health measure. And global emissions in 2020 fell 6%. We need them to fall at more than that amount each and every year for the next decade in order to take targets like 1.5 seriously. And that's why almost every scenario at this point to get anywhere close to the goals we need to achieve include huge amounts of negative emissions. The good news is there's an increasing recognition of the urgency of this problem. More and more countries that are committing to be net zero by 2050, more and more companies that are committing to be net zero by 2050. But as I said, understandable skepticism about whether everybody really understands what it takes to achieve those goals, how difficult it is, and whether the current existing policy mechanisms are in place that would give you confidence those goals could be achieved. So there was a report. I mean, there is good news also, which we should not lose sight of. A decade plus ago, the kind of outlook for where emissions were headed was higher than it is today. And now, if you look at the ambition of the pledges, they take you somewhere around 2.7, 2.8, 3 degrees Celsius, depending on what estimates you use. The UN just put out another report this week, that assumes we achieve those pledges, and there's understandable skepticism about that, and even if we do, that still falls short. And that even though we've seen tremendous growth in solar and wind and batteries, I mean, if you had said a decade ago that the cost of solar would decline more than 90%, the cost of batteries more than 90%, the cost of wind more than 80%, these were beyond many people's hopes for what we could achieve. And the growth rates annually that we see in renewable energy are staggering. And yet oil use is going up and gas use is going up and coal is at least plateauing. Maybe it's going up, but it's certainly not falling off a cliff. At the same time that the benchmark is changing, the goal is changing. Discussion in the international community of 2 degrees warming as a target Celsius, well below 2 degrees, now 1.5 in net zero, driven by the science. That is what we need to do, and even that is going to have harmful climate impacts. But the International Energy Agency, put out a much publicized report in March that got a lot of headlines, particularly for its finding that there should be no new investment in oil and gas supply if we were on a pathway consistent with net zero by 2050. And a lot of people criticized it as being unrealistic. And when I hear that, and what I say is like, I don't know what unrealistic means. Like, what unrealistic means is this is really hard. And if you look at the pathway the IEA mapped out, the next decade is, we need 100 new nuclear power plants around the world by 2030, according to the IEA model. You can look here at the other benchmarks where by 2030, 60% of the global car sales are electric. It's 4% today. And you just go on and on through this whole chart. I won't go through everything here. And you can see, how significant the challenge is. But when people criticize the IEA, I mean, you could make some different assumptions in the modeling. Melissa can talk more about that. But fundamentally, it's in the ballpark. It just tells us if we're going to make commitments like 1.5 in 2050, and we're going to keep saying that, let's really be honest and understand what we mean and how much has to change, how quickly, and how off track we are from being there today. This tells you how off track we are. The blue line is what net zero 2050 means, according to the IEA. So again, you can quibble with the modeling, but it's broadly consistent with other models that are out there. The blue line is net zero, so you can see what happens to oil demand, which is it begins to fall immediately and falls quickly. It doesn't get to zero, by the way. There is a role for carbon capture and carbon removal technology. So oil demand's about a quarter what it is today in the net zero scenario, and natural gas rises a little bit longer, and then it starts to fall quickly to get to net zero. But still, about 45% as much gas use in 2050 as today, because part of that is blue hydrogen, part of that is gas with carbon capture in the power sector. The gray line is the previous scenario from the IEA called the Sustainable Development Scenario, which was well below 2 degrees. So it's around 1.7, 1.8 degrees warming in their modeling. It's directionally the same, but obviously the pace of decline is different. There's a big difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And the orange line is where we're headed today, which is nowhere close to where we need to be. We have it's probably a little higher now because more and more countries are promising things, like Saudi Arabia this week promising to be net zero by 2060. So 70-80% of the world's emissions are covered by pledges, promises to get to net zero by 2050. Only around 20% are covered by actual binding policies that would require you to get to net zero by 2050. So we need stronger policy. We have a policy ambition gap, and we need more technology. About 50% of the emission reductions between now and 2050 need to come from technologies that are not yet available at commercial scale. We can put a lot of renewables into the grid. We can put batteries into cars. We are not yet at a point when we can make zero carbon steel and cement, and heavy duty trucks have a way to go. Obviously, ships and airplanes. And these are big numbers. There's more emissions from making steel than there are from all the world's cars combined. We need technological innovation, and we need policies and new business models to get those to scale. So this can't go on, in my view. And one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about is how does this ambition reality gap reach a breaking point? It kind of has to. And the famous American economist Herbert Stein said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Sort of how I feel about climate change in terms of the impacts we are already seeing and are going to see. But how do we get there? And at what point over the next X number of years that tension reaches a breaking point where people say, things have to change much, much faster than they are, and what kind of policies or other actions become contemplated that are in many ways more extreme than those being contemplated today. The flip side is what it might mean for affordability of energy, for reliability, for security of supply. And you see a global energy crisis today playing out in Europe and Asia, not mostly caused by the energy transition. It's about a recovery from a pandemic. But if people start to see real or perceived impacts where more aggressive action to decarbonize, they fear will affect them. The US is a good example. If you look at what's happening in the US, climate change is now the second most important issue to American voters. That's a big change from where it was before. And then if you ask Americans, are they willing to pay 25 cents per gallon more for gasoline? 75% say no. So there is also a gap between what people are willing to countenance and what impacts it may have for them to take much stronger actions as we need to get on track. Do you want to talk about any of this, Melissa?
No, you're good. Thanks.
Well, I talked about some of this before, so maybe I'll be brief, and then we'll have time for conversation. We have a set of policies that are being contemplated in the United States today. The Clean Electricity Standard, like a performance standard, for complicated reasons of our Senate and parliamentary process. You can't do anything without 60 votes. So in order to get things done, this administration was trying to use, and Congress was trying to use, the budget reconciliation process, where you can do things with 50 or 51 votes with a tie-breaking vote by Kamala Harris. And so the question was, how do we set goals for, in this case, the electricity sector that would achieve a certain target, which was to decarbonize the electricity sector by 2035. You can do that through legislation, ideally, like a clean electricity standard. If you need to do it through budget reconciliation, there was a mechanism that a variety of people developed, which was a combination of incentives and penalties for utilities to meet annual increases in clean electricity that would be consistent with decarbonization by 2035 and 80% clean electricity by 2030. At present, that seems unlikely to be the outcome of the budget negotiations in Congress. A few senators are strongly opposed to it, including Joe Manchin, who's much in the news these days. So that is probably not the approach that's going to be adopted. There had been some talk that maybe there would be a reversion to market mechanisms that had been much more on the table before. When I worked in the Obama administration, they pursued a cap and trade program in Congress. Bernie Sanders, when he ran for president in 2016, had as the centerpiece of his campaign, a carbon tax. And there's still several senators like Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island or Ron Wyden who support a carbon tax. That's another approach that people can take. That's the approach being taken by the European Union, probably not on the table in the US today. So then another approach would just be subsidies and incentives. The government foots the bill for a lot of this. There's a limit to how much the government can foot the bill. I don't think we can government subsidize our way to net zero, but there is a lot that the government can do with spending to try to bring down the cost of clean energy and make it more affordable for businesses and consumers. That is, I think, more likely to be what comes out of the current negotiations in Congress. There's a really important role for government in R&D to bring down the cost of new technologies and help to commercialize those. At the Center on Global Energy Policy, we wrote a book about a year and a half, I forget, just before this administration came in, so it must have been about a year ago, Energizing America, which was a roadmap for how to go big on clean energy R&D. It was kind of an example of what Melissa was saying early on, which is about 2.5, 3 years ago, we identified a possible need in the policy community, which was an administration that would want to go big on clean energy would one of the things they would do would be to go big on R&D. Let's really think in a much more ambitious way about clean energy technology. How do you do that? What do you spend it on? What forms does it take? Is it loan guarantees? Is it tax credits? Is it basic research? Is it demonstration and deployment? A lot of ideas out there, but what we were interested in is what does evidence and history and experience and analysis tell us the right answer to those questions are. So that takes time. And so we built a team to do research into that topic and then published a book a year ago laying out what we thought the evidence with government investment in R&D would tell you about the places you would give you the biggest return on every dollar invested to invest in clean energy research. And it actually has been a playbook that, in part because many people at the Energy Center on Global Energy Policy went into the administration, that I think people are using and pursuing, that's helping them think about how to shape a more ambitious clean energy R&D policy. And then there's a set of other, there's a long list of the kind of policy instruments that are available if you want to use those. One of the things we spend, so I won't go through the whole list, but one of the things I'll just flag is the importance, and this is where something like the climate school can really be impactful, is the range of barriers that exist to deploying clean energy at scale. So if you look at analyses others have done, like Princeton University did a great study on what it would look like to get to net zero emissions in the US by mid-century. Just look at the maps of how much land in the US needs to be covered by wind farms, solar panels, and transmission lines. It's really hard to build stuff in this country. It's hard to get the permitting. It's hard to overcome local opposition, even to clean energy, because people tend to support it, but they don't like it in their backyard. Environmental groups are opposed to transmission lines in the Northeast to bring, say, hydropower in from Canada into New York. So there's a lot of opposition to building anything. It's not just oil and gas pipelines. It's just hard to build stuff. So we need to think about streamlined siting and permitting processes. And by streamlined, I don't mean ones that overrun or run over community concerns or that ignore real environmental impacts, but just that work better and more efficiently. If we're going to build we need to put a lot of steel on the ground really fast in a myriad ways if we're going to meet these climate goals. So thinking about new business models, thinking about the financial sector, thinking about incentives that will unlock private capital, thinking about policy, regulatory, permitting barriers. Hydrogen's a good example. I think we probably will need hydrogen to be part of the mix for parts of the economy that are hard to electrify. We don't even really know how to permit hydrogen pipelines at scale. We do some of it, but not a huge amount now. So we're going to need new tools that are developed, as well as important equity and justice issues with all of these potential technologies that need to be thought through, and general building public understanding, social awareness, and acceptance for the different solutions that are being pursued, because they all come with different potential costs and benefits. If you're doing a lot more carbon capture, it means there's extractive industries that are continuing. Those may have particular impacts in local communities in the Gulf Coast near Houston or something, and often those are low income and historically disadvantaged communities, and they have concerns with carbon capture at scale precisely for those reasons. They're real concerns and they need to be addressed. So there are a lot of policies, as I said, that are on the table that could help us get to these goals. We talked about some of those earlier, and this sort of shows, I won't go through all the acronyms here, but this kind of shows if you have the Building Back Better plan or the Clean Electricity Performance Plan, if you take them out, like where it gets you. And I think what you'll see the administration talking about next week is that even without the Clean Electricity Performance Plan, that was the reconcilable version of a clean electricity standard, a range of other tools and government incentives can get you on a pathway, not all the way there, but on a pathway by 2030 to be consistent with net zero in the electricity sector by 2035. There are a number of takeaways you can take from this slide, but what you see here, just to be clear about it, is the share of new vehicles sold that are electric in Norway, and then that's oil demand in Norway. So this is a reminder that policies often can have unintended consequences. They can be designed in ways that don't have as much impact as you want. Here, it's just a reminder that the energy math is really hard. Climate math is really unforgiving, and the impacts of climate and rising CO2 levels are going to be pretty severe. Energy math is hard too. Only 25% of oil demand is used for cars. Cars tend to be what you electrify today. It's harder to electrify other parts of transportation. Not to mention the 30% of oil that's used for things other than transportation, and it takes time for the vehicle stock to turn over. So that is why you've seen extraordinary growth in sales of new vehicles that are electric in Norway, and oil demand has not budged because it's come down a little bit in cars. It's going to take time because it's going to take another decade or so for the fleet to turn over, and it's growing in other parts of the economy, particularly petrochemicals, where a lot of oil is used. So, as I said, we don't quite know where U.S. policy is going to land. The best guess now is we'll see a very, very significant level historically. I mean, you remember when the Obama administration pursued the green stimulus package and the Recovery Act, that was $90 billion. They're talking about 3 times that now for climate spending in Washington. So it's a lot of government spending, plus regulation, plus state level action that can get us a meaningful part of the way there. And there are a lot of modeling efforts that help us understand how far this can get us, but also we need to have better tools to help us track and monitor where those emissions are actually coming from and whether they're leading to the desired effects. I'll stop there. I don't know, Melissa, if you wanted to add anything to what I said, and then look forward to a conversation.
No, I think it's great. I just wanted to flag there was a question in the chat that I responded to, giving a link to Energizing America, which we have on our website and you can download for free for those who are interested. And thanks to Lisa for that question. Otherwise, ideal, shall we go into questions?
Yes. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Melissa. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and then I also ask people, you can make the questions on the chat, or I'm going to give some time for anyone who wants to ask their questions directly to Jason and Melissa to unmute themselves shortly. But first, we have a couple of questions from Michael Wright from NASA. I'm going to go to the first 2 questions that he has. So one, how are the high carbon impacts of natural gas, particularly its high upstream and fugitive emissions, being conveyed to policymakers and the public alike? And 2, how does nuclear, which is more efficient now than decades ago, fit into the plans to achieve a zero-emission energy portfolio?
Yeah, great questions. And I'll let Melissa talk about the first because it's a big area of her research as well. But I will just note that I don't think you've ever seen issues of methane emissions and leakage on an agenda at a UN climate meeting the way it is in Glasgow this year, and the significant elevation of focus on that problem, the commitment that the Europeans and the US started for 30 countries to come together and promise to reduce methane emissions 30% by 2030. When that happened, I sort of noted normally to make big a dent in emissions, you need the biggest emitters to be part of an agreement. With methane emissions, you also need the biggest energy producers to be part of the agreement because that's where a lot of the methane leaks come from. So there's a lot of attention this week to Saudi Arabia committing to be net zero by 2060 and some skepticism around it too. But they did join that methane pledge, which was not insignificant. Now, of course, they need to be held accountable, and we will have increased satellite data and granularity to understand methane emissions that I think are going to draw much more scrutiny to people that are laggards in this issue. So the amount of focus on it is really shifted dramatically. Do you want to add to that, Melissa?
How would I comment on the nuclear question? Because I think it's a part of a broader question about, in decarbonization pathways across all the scenarios that we've run for years now, or at least I've been involved in running for 15 or so years now. We see power sector as the backbone of decarbonization. We use more electricity in the future. We use it for more things. So whether it's our cars, parts of industry, we electrify a lot of things. And it's one of the options that allows us to accelerate progress because we do know how to decarbonize with current technologies a lot of our power generation. Nuclear is one of them. I put a link in the chat to something that's related to this question that was asked around the role of nuclear in the future. So something that we also see consistently across all the different modeling exercises about how you have an affordable and reliable transition. So we keep bills from kind of having a hockey stick effect as we get more and more decarbonized. We already have 1 in 3 Americans who are energy insecure. So we certainly don't want to make that worse. In addition to all the global things that Jason commented on earlier. But within how we achieve that affordable transition and maintain reliability in the system, so don't accept, which I think we can all believe that there would be an unhappy public, and we would be unhappy if we started having more blackouts than we already do today. So keep that affordability and reliability. What you end up needing to achieve that is 3 buckets of technologies within your power sector mix. The first one is these variable renewables, things like wind and solar. The fuel is free. When they're around, they're extremely cheap and they help us keep the cost down. But you complement them with the second bucket, which is around energy storage. So you do use batteries, but you also use seasonal storage technology, some of whom we've figured out, some of whom we haven't. Hydrogen is an interesting example of this that actually plays in a couple of buckets here. We know how to do it, but it's not at the cost points we want it to be at yet if we want to keep costs down overall. But the third bucket is firm dispatchable power. And so within that, that's where nuclear plays. And so nuclear is a technology that we have in the mix right now. And that we also have advanced reactor technologies that could come into the mix in the future. And what happens if you eliminate any of these 3 buckets is you see that increase in costs and or decrease in reliability in the system. And so we have to ask ourselves a real direct question, which is, nuclear isn't the only firm dispatchable power resource. Natural gas with carbon capture, utilization, and storage could be another, as could geothermal, where we have those resources, and, big hydro. Again, we need to map out things, and we're actually partnering with Argonne National Labs on looking at how reliable hydro is going to be in the future. But we have to ask ourselves the question of, if we're willing to accept the trade-offs that come when we eliminate one of the technologies that can help us in achieving a zero carbon future. And there's a lot of interesting questions around nuclear that go beyond decarbonization and beyond power that we address. Dr. Matt Bowen actually leads our nuclear power program here at the center, because it's a set of really important questions that we need to grapple with head on, not just here in the US, but globally. So that's my short/long answer to that question. But I put a link to the fact sheet in the chat for anyone who's interested.
That is perfect. Thank you, Melissa. So we have a couple of questions from people that I know that are from Columbia University. I'm going to go first to Anastasia, that she's a NASA GIS, and then we'll move to Joaquin, that is a CMS principal investigator, and he's based in Lamont, and kind of like do the, tie this information to the work that we do at NASA, on remote sensing and satellite data. So Anastasia asks, what is the status and outlook of the subsidies in coal plants and oil and gas drilling?
So I think the answer to that depends on whether you're talking about domestic or global, and depends on how you define subsidies. That's often the source of some dispute. So you see very large numbers for how massive global fossil fuel subsidies are. The very biggest numbers are calling a subsidy, not without some justification, the failure to internalize a carbon price. So we're just not accounting for the social damage, the cost of climate change, when we use fossil fuels. And so if you look at the lack of a carbon price as a subsidy, we're not making you pay for your pollution, the numbers are staggering. They're huge. Fossil fuel subsidies also take the form of consumption subsidies around the world. So many places around the world subsidize the cost of energy for people, especially fossil fuels or gasoline. And many oil and gas producers in particular have almost free, very cheap gasoline, and that obviously encourages wasteful consumption. Those numbers are really big as well. And there's been progress to roll back fossil fuel subsidies, but it's difficult politically and difficult economically. And then there's a sort of more narrow category of fossil fuel production subsidies in the US, which is a range of tax credits and accounting rules that allow for people to allow for companies to to depreciate their capital expenses faster than others. Some of those are available to industry at large, and it includes, but is not limited to oil and gas. Some of them are specific to the oil and gas industry and are fossil fuel subsidies there. If you add up those numbers, that's about 4 billion a year, I think. So, a smaller number, and not much justification for those. There's been many efforts, including by this administration, to try to roll those back. I think every Democratic administration has put in the budget rolling back direct fossil fuel subsidies. But it has, I think the prospects for those to be rolled back in this Congress are probably not great, given how closely divided it is.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Anastasia, for the question. So, moving now to the question from Joaquin. As I mentioned, Joaquin is part of the CMS science team, and he's a principal investigator. He has an ongoing CMS project that is on biooptical monitoring and evaluation system for improving satellite estimates of ocean net primary production for carbon cycling and climate change studies. So obviously he has an interest on oceans. So there's two questions, and I'm gonna add a third one that is more broad. So he asks, like, for the energy forecast models, do you see any satellite-based carbon products right now? And also, is there any interest in hydrothermal energy or ocean energy for decarbonization? And the third one, Melissa and Jason, is broadly, many of the people that we have here are NASA scientists, carbon scientists, or they collaborate with, our carbon monitoring system program at NASA. What do you see is the role of U.S. government agencies like NASA that focus on research on this energy transition? What can you tell us? So I'm going to leave those three questions.
Jason, I think you're smiling at me because when it comes to modeling, I love these questions. But if you want to take a first crack at it, go for it.
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
So full disclosure, energy systems modeler here, but I do techno-economic optimization models. So when it comes to these forecasts, so we talk about energy models that forecast, to do really short-term forecasts, and also project these long-term to mid-century and beyond type of energy transition scenarios. So I'll speak to both at a really high level. For the most part, no. We use some data that is gathered by satellites to check and calibrate our models, but in terms of actually incorporating them in the models, they're not directly incorporated. And this is really interesting, and it actually goes to your third question, which is saying, how can these data actually help us in the things we need to do in the future? So one thing that we haven't been doing in the past, and that's not included in the big modeling exercises right now that you see coming out of the International Energy Agency, the Department of Energy, et cetera, though DOE doesn't do net zero yet, but with these future energy scenario projections, we don't actually integrate climate change modeling and energy systems infrastructure modeling. So behind the IEA's modeling are techno-economic models, designed at times, which is GAMS-based code, but essentially it's saying, here's a cost for a technology, here's a deployment pathway, so it takes so many years to build out whatever the widget is. And then what we say is, if the future we demand so much energy, how do we supply it with these technologies? What we don't incorporate is, okay, how do we think about power system reliability as one example in a changing climate? And so having some really good climate modeling, which needs data sets like the ones you're talking about, is very important in this. And this is part of something that we're trying to advance. And our head of modeling, Dr. James Glenn, is at the forefront of this and has worked on this for a number of years in Europe and is now with us at Columbia. We're doing through projects like the one I mentioned earlier in partnership with Argonne. We've seen efforts like this for other infrastructure, but we haven't seen it holistically for energy and for the big infrastructure that we saw go down, for example, during the Texas blackouts, over the winter, or, California with wildfires and everything else. What happens when things go down, and what happens when the rate of weather-related events changes as the climate changes? So there's really interesting intersectional research here to be done, but that's not in today's kind of energy scenario projection modeling behind these big scenarios that we look at. The other thing that I'll touch on within this is that there's some very interesting analysis that needs to be done to ground some of these discussions around, I'm thinking, Jason, around like carbon border adjustments and getting into places where we just don't have data right now, like any way to get data about places where we don't have numbers. we could spend an hour just talking about the places I would love to have data in that I just don't. And so satellite and satellite-based data acquisition is very useful for those types of things. And to Jason's point earlier, for saying we implemented a policy, we thought it would have this effect. Did it? Did it not? And when you get into things like carbon border adjustments, when you get into things like offsets, these type of data that folks in this room are gathering and using, I think can be very useful to the discussions we need to have and we want to put evidence next to. I think I hit all three, but if I missed anything in there, let me know. And I don't know, Jason, if you want to add any of that.
No, that was great. I think that point about having the data, having the monitoring is important not just for government policy, but we're seeing an evolution where an increasing amount of climate action is going to be voluntary corporate activity. And may not think that's a good thing, but that's the reality of where we are because policy is not able to be strong enough. And we need much better tools to help understand whether to hold people accountable. And also we're creating asset classes now. Like a bunch of people are going to agree to be net zero by 2050 and say we're going to take this, we're going to build something this way instead of this way. We're going to plant trees. We're going to, whatever we're going to do. And then does that actually deliver emission reductions? And we're going to have, it's a commodity. We're going to have carbon credits that are bought and sold at massive scale. It's $1 trillion market. Is there any reason, is there any credibility behind whether those emission reductions are real or not? And we know that in land-based offsets in forestry, the traditional offset market, there's a lot of good work to do. I'm on the board of the Nature Conservancy for a reason, but for when people don't do that well, there can be some garbage as well that gets sold as a carbon offset.
Thank you, Melissa and Jason. So we have a question from Bart Cruz. He's in California. He used to work for the Air Resources Board in California, and you were talking that California, along with New York, have doing a great job, with both controlling and also monitoring greenhouse gas emissions. But before going to that question, I'm gonna open if there is anyone that has a question or comment that they want to do directly to Melissa or to Jason. You can unmute and you can ask directly. Are there any questions or comments? Let's see. If not, and I'll give one last
Can I ask
moment.
a question?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Joaquin from Columbia University. My question is that if you were called to Congress tomorrow and were asked by the president, how can NASA help with your efforts at decarbonization and with improving your forecast models, what would you tell the president? Because NASA's mission is to protect our planet Earth. So I see that there's a lot of synergy between the Energy Institute at Columbia University and what NASA does. So I would like to see something that is really focused and how we could take this forward. Thank you.
I don't know, Melissa, if you want to take that. I mean, a starting point obviously is to not just today, but for decades, the warnings about this problem and the understanding of it have come from the work that NASA has done, that NASA's done. That if you were to put little plaques on the seminal locations in the history of trying to tackle this crisis, there'd be one probably on a few floors above where Seinfeld had lunch every day for the kind of work that was done there to help understand what climate change is going to mean. So that seems first and foremost. And I think I'd love to hear your thoughts, Melissa, on how we think about taking that fundamental work in earth sciences and helping to, at a much more granular level, understand and model the impacts of climate, because we not only use those to motivate policy action to reduce emissions, but we know, unfortunately, we're probably going to fall short. And we're going to need to think about tools of adaptation and resilience at a localized scale, not just in New York City, but in some of the poorest parts of the world. And we need the information in order to help do that. And then that's a role for policymakers and USAID or the Development Finance Institution or all of the places that will engage in civil society, the Rockefeller Foundation. All these people are going to be working to engage communities on the ground and need the data to do it in ways that are accessible and usable to policymakers, right? If I were to look at what you all look at every day, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't understand it. It needs to be produced in formats and in timeframes that are what policymakers need to do their work every day.
So I'm going to stop Jason there because I see Anastasia has her hand raised, and I think she works at GIS, NASA GIS. So this is a good discussion that we can have here because there is a connection between the work that we do at Goddard, Earth Sciences in NASA, GIS, Lamont, you at the Center of Global Energy Policy. So I will let Anastasia. You can do your question or comment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jason and Melissa, for coming to CMS today and giving this talk. I think it's very important. I'm a climate modeler at NASA GIS doing the carbon cycle. I'm mostly on the ocean side of things, but recently we have developed our Earth system model. We have a lot of collaborations with the agricultural sector through our impacts group and perhaps some and the United Nations. But I think as you both pointed out, we should be making the connection, since we are both local in New York City, the connections between the energy transition models and the climate models. We are simulating, we are predicting the outlook of extreme events, tipping points in the model. We can justify different scenarios above and beyond what CMIP, the IPCC, put forward. So this could be useful for regional studies that Melissa talked about. For example, if we want to change the emissions profile of a certain region within the United States or the globe. And obviously, first and for us, it will be the research, scientific questions which would drive this collaboration, but for you, I'm sure it will be industry related and applications, yes?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yes.
I couldn't agree more. Like, these types of collaborations will help us take it to the next level that we need it to. And we need people who have specialized knowledge and also broad knowledge of where things connect. And I think I know what I know, and I also know that I don't know a lot. And I need to get people in rooms, and we all need to have other people in rooms to bring that knowledge to the table. And to ignore, as I said earlier, like these intersections between like all the infrastructure we're building out, all the things that are happening, adaptation, mitigation, like we have to understand what's happening with a changing climate and what's likely to happen. What was, a long tail is not a long tail anymore. The 500-year storm becoming a 100-year, and even more, it's rainy or it's hotter, but where is it raining? Where is it hotter? And who lives there? And what are they using in terms of energy? Like, these intersections need interdisciplinary teams of people to have the big impacts that we want to positively impact people's lives. So yes, all the things you said, yes.
Okay.
Agreed.
So one last question to go to Bart. As I mentioned, he used to work at the California Air Resources Board. So he asks, have you analyzed pathways to fast reductions in the SLCPs, including methane? AR6 concludes they are collectively equivalent to CO2, and they're our best chance to reduce the probability of triggering catastrophic tipping points. 100-year global warming potentials heavily discount their actual contribution to climate forcing.
So I was just going to say briefly on this, I would say all of these short-lived climate pollutants are very important, absolutely. And when we talk about CO2 equivalent in a lot of our models, they take these types of other pollutants. It's not just the CO2, it's all these other things that have this global warming potential. We take that in with the equivalents. What I'll also expand, and I hope Bart will appreciate this because of CARB, and you have to think about the other air pollutants that are going there too. Jason, I was about to mention Mary Nichols on our team and the great work she's doing, but I realize we're out of time. And so I'll just say, when we're talking about, from how I come to a lot of these problems with about maximizing public health benefit, we're also thinking about what all the other types of pollution are, many of which, have these dual impacts, but make us sick don't let us live long, healthy lives. So factoring all these things in so we understand trade-offs of decisions and trade-offs of different policy designs is very important. So I'll leave it at that because I
Yeah.
know we're already a minute
Jason,
late.
any last remarks?
No, just thanks for the invitation to be with you today. Thanks for the work you do each and every day. And I think the point Anastasia made a moment ago is really important. I hope there are ways that we can continue to find areas for collaboration, bring energy systems modeling that Melissa does together with the climate modeling that people here do, and hopefully a climate school will be one good umbrella to bring a lot of this together too across the whole university: the science, the engineering, the finance, the policy, social issues, foreign policy, where I spend a lot of my time. So I'm excited. I hope there's a way to follow up on this conversation to get to know all of you in person and have you meet more of the people at the Center on Global Energy Policy too.
Definitely. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Melissa. I think we can follow up by email. If anyone wants to connect with Jason or Melissa, you can send me an email. We have a big science team meeting 3 days in November coming up that we're going to be discussing everything related to carbon monitoring, all of the projects that we have, the stakeholders that we have, how they're using the data products for exactly decision making. So Jason and Melissa, I will follow up and send you the information about the meeting just in case you have time to connect, and then hopefully we can continue these conversations. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.